Well, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening. You're here with Thomas Stokell and Kit Miller. Kit, can you hear me?
I can, thank you.
Wonderful, wonderful, wonderful. Kit and I just had a bit of fun trying to get all the audios and stuff to work. We'll call it fun, won't we, Kit?
Yeah.
Good. As per usual, Kit, we start off with a bit of gratitude, and Kit and I will share something from this week that we're particularly grateful for. And if you all want to, if you're on the computer, you should also be able to type in questions throughout the session, and of course you can type in things that you want to say to us or us to say to the whole group. But Kit, without further ado, what are you grateful for this week?
Well, I'm grateful for the one day of the year that we stop and think about gratitude. You know, even though, like many of our holidays, it's a day that has a real mixed bag in terms of what it actually means to all the people here. You know, much like Independence Day didn't mean independence for many, many people. Thanksgiving isn't a day of celebration for any, you know, the people on this continent of First Nation and Native American heritage. And I still want to stop and appreciate that a day just related to noticing gratitude is powerful medicine, very good medicine for all of us. So I'm grateful for Thanksgiving as a holiday. Yeah, and I just wish it had a different history. How about you, Thomas?
Well, yesterday I spent some time in nature for a nice walk in the woods, and it's fall here in the US, so it was particularly beautiful, and it was nice to be at peace in nature as always, and to be with family and people I love, and to smile at people coming the other way on the trail and saying good day, or probably howdy was probably the greeting of choice yesterday, just to fit in.
Howdy?
Howdy.
Wow. Wow.
Oh, maybe I should have put more of an accent on the howdy, but just to spread the love, you know, as you go along this trail, to try and cheer people up so they might pass a howdy or a good day on to the next person they meet.
Mm-hmm.
So it was I always quite enjoy that, spreading the love and spreading some smiles around.
Mm-hmm.
Some people have chipped in here and said, I'm grateful for the start of the session and the modeling reminder to be grateful. Grateful for my son who slept before the webinar. He contributed to my learning and growing. Grateful for serenity in my life. Grateful for dear friends and the force of life. I'm grateful for a conversation I had last night with my 16-year-old daughter. Who talked to me more about her interest in boys than she has so far. So some gratitude from all over the world coming in. Cool, Kit. Well, let's get into it. What do you want to? What would you like to talk about today?
I'm feeling happily distracted by listening to these other celebrations. So, yes, and I really want to talk about the place of celebration and gratitude for fuel for our lives and the work. But I'll put that down for now and look forward to talking about it another time. So as last week we spent a chunk of time speaking about the issue of how to relate to suffering, how to relate to our narratives in relation to challenge. And I just wanted, there was a little bit more about the issue of suffering that I found to be important, that I just want to make sure that I have a chance to talk to. And then I'd like to spend some time today speaking about the issue of anger in our lives, and then just open it up for some questions, as whatever people would want to chat about after that, if that sounds okay. So I want to think about with you just for a few minutes, and again, this builds on what we spoke of last week about the issue of heartbreak as a kind of a power plant in the world. And I want to say that I've been building a sort of a mental rubric or sort of typology, if you will, of my heroes for a long time, and I'm always so happy when another common element reveals itself in the study of different people that I've regarded and come to learn from as heroes in the world. And I think one of the most common elements relates to how they use suffering, and really look at how they transmute their own personal suffering into one of universality. And of course, one of the most famous was Gandhi's when he was during his first weeks in South Africa, when he was tossed off a train in the Pietermaritzburg station there for daring to make use of his first-class train ticket, and his refusal to move off the cars that were serving brown and black people. And when he looked back on his life, he said that night he spent on the bench on that train platform was a critical moment for him, because he did this critical moral imaginative leap of not just looking at his own suffering but connecting that fact of his experience to the fact of the experiences of thousands of others, of other people of Indian descent who were living in South Africa at that time. And he did describe it as the most transformative moment, one of the most transformative moments of his life. So, I'm very interested in the ability of suffering as a way as a doorway, and as a way to see ourselves and other people, because very little suffering that we are likely to experience in our lives is actually unique to us. Anything that breaks your heart, if your friends disappoint you, your lover breaks your heart, a photo from a war zone, all those things, like they can lead us to kind of feeling alone and isolated, or we can use it to bust open our thinking and realize how deeply related and connected we all are to each other. I'm a big fan of the Buddhist teacher Pema Chodron, and she has a practice that she calls just like me. So whenever something difficult happens, we can engage our moral imagination and talk and just wonder, who else has experienced this? Who else has lived like this? And when we relate to any difficulty or anguish or suffering in our lives with that sort of openness, then it can create a sense of connection for us with others versus isolation. And for me, in my own life, that has been very powerful and good medicine. So I think about the idea of breaking your heart or having a heartbreak as a power plant. So instead of being something that diminishes you or causes you to turn into bitterness or makes you shrink, that you can actually use it to get bigger in terms of who you want to be, how you want to have a role in the world to make things better. I experience that running away from pain literally is, it's a proverbial tiger with its tail ablaze. The faster I'm going to run, the more oxygen I'm giving it. And turning to face pain is just powerful medicine, And generally, when I've been willing to walk through it and now develop the habit to walk toward pain instead of away from it, what's often on the other side is presence or clarity, certainly a sense of integrity sometimes, and often like some transformational thinking. So that's one thing I just wanted to say a little bit about how we can use our broken hearts as a source of power in the world. And curious to hear any thoughts and reflections on that from you, Thomas, too.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, given recent events, not just in America, but around the world, the fear that exists and the suffering that exists, and of course the anger that exists. And I think anger can obviously be used as a force, as you're mentioning now, to fuel action and commitment and resolve to change things and make the world better.
Yep.
And I'd be interested to hear your sort of any tips and tricks that we could be mindful of for those of us who wish to do that, can put those in place to help us to be effective in the world and achieving what we want to see achieved. And of course, anger can be used as a more negative emotion and force to, cause more suffering and more fear and more pain. And so we need to make sure that we're using our anger wisely if we can, and I think being conscious of it, for instance, and then being aware of its power for good and for bad, quote unquote. So I'd be interested in hearing you talk about either of those things, Karen, of pain as and anger as a force to cause more suffering, and of course any ideas and tips and tricks for anger as converting anger as a force for good.
Yep, I'd love to. Before we move towards that, I just want to say, for me, the critical workout of our moral imaginations, where we link our ability to relate our suffering to the suffering of others, is so important. Because I think that one of the things that might be happening in the world right now that for me is deeply, critically important is that we may be moving away from a siloed perspective, or more of us. Some people have already been there, but more of us, including myself, may be moving away from the siloed perspective of caring about this issue, or that issue, to recognizing how there's not a lot of struggles. There's one struggle, that the struggles of veterans are related to the struggles of immigrants, which is related to the struggles of people who are disabled, that we might begin to see the universality of struggle and recognize that any one struggle has a potential to be our own. I was very moved that there was a large group of veterans, for instance, this week. They went out to stand in solidarity with the people at Standing Rock, especially after some of the violence that occurred there some days ago. And I'm just so moved by these men and women who have themselves so directly experienced the violence in their time in the armed services, probably, to be willing to go and put themselves again on the front line of that on behalf of their brothers and sisters. Is this at Standing Rock? Is this their fight by a narrow definition? No. In the broader definition, and this is something that Angela Davis, in her most recent book, which I highly recommend, called Freedom is a Constant Struggle, and where she draws the connections between Ferguson, Palestine, and movements in general. She says, again, she's the one who pointed out to me, there's not struggles, there's struggle. So when we begin to weave ourselves in that way, we may move from being overwhelmed by that to actually being energized and excited by that, because we can see ourselves in everybody. There's a nice line in a Joni Mitchell song about that. I see myself in everyone just at this moment of the world, and I love that. So yes, so anger. So I want to speak about anger in a couple different ways. I want to speak about it as the internal work that I've experienced looking at anger, and then I want to speak about it more as a kind of an energy source. So efforts to undo my own issues around anger have been critical, because I want to be less afraid of anger in everybody, and so that means I have to start with it in myself. I have been on a long journey of trying to understand and relate to my own anger so that I can be not afraid of it in other people too. And so in my looking at anger, and honestly, I don't remember now where this came from. It might have been something that Marshall Rosenberg said years ago. I don't remember where it is now, where this came from now. But the idea that has really held a lot of usefulness for me in relation to anger is that anger isn't my first feeling. It's some other feeling that becomes so intense so quickly that it crystallizes and manifests in my awareness as anger, but there's something else underneath it reliably. And I had an opportunity to reflect on this really, especially in the days right after September 11th occurred. And some of you may have remember me. This is a story I love to tell about anger. That the night of I'm living five and a half hours away from Manhattan, and this is September 11th, and there's a tremendous shock, and people are still not knowing who is buried in the rubble or not, and these images are being shown, and there was this tremendous sense of shock. And I got a phone call that night from a school asking me to come in and work with some kids the next day, and they wanted me to work with as many groups as possible, 15 minutes each group, mostly third, fourth graders. And so I said, of course I will. I hung up the phone and I thought, what am I going to do? What will be supportive for these young humans? And I thought about speaking about anger. So when I went into the schools that day, I said, I want to talk to you about anger because I want to enable you guys to be warriors for peace. And by giving you a clue about anger, that has been a helpful clue for me, which is that anger isn't our first feeling. And my story to illustrate that is a little person runs out in the middle of the road, is almost hit by a car. Their caregiver, whoever the caregiver is, older brother or sister, mom, dad, grandma, grandpa, whoever, grabs him, brings him by the side of the road and shouts, don't ever do that again. And I asked the kids that day, September 12th, what's going on in that caregiver? They sound very, very angry, very angry. And the kids said, they're scared. So then we just ended up talking about how often fear, real extreme fear for safety and well-being, often shows up as anger, and how differently we might relate to people who sound angry, but when we really are deeply able to experience them as fearful. So I want to, for me, that's just sort of a basic primer on anger. And it's been so useful for me to be around people who are angry, or certainly appear angry, and not be afraid of their anger. And I don't know about you guys, but I was trained to be deeply afraid of anger, especially the anger of the giants, of my childhood, called mom and dad, who are often very angry. And my dad especially really struggled with alcoholism, so he was coming home drunk a lot, and so it was very scary, for me sometimes to be little and to see that, happening between these giant people who are responsible for my well-being back then. So I have fear in me in relation to anger, and I just decided that if I was going to be as useful as I wanted to be in the world, that I needed to be able to not be afraid of anger in me or other people. So since continuing to look at this over a course of quite a few years now, I've now discovered for me that I only get angry reliably when I hit the intersection of helplessness and caring. So only when I care deeply about something that I'm helpless to change do I get angry. So now when I notice an energy coming up that certainly would resemble anger, I just start to get curious. What is it that I'm caring deeply about that I'm feeling helpless to relate to? And of course, this is also so important because many times these feelings are often reserved for the people also that are very close to us. So we might kind of keep it together and might be able to have a sort of a perspective on people all day long. And then when we get home to our own, peeps, to the people who are most likely to turn up at our funeral, those are the ones that, that we have the least resources for. So I especially feel tender offering any perspective and support on anger because I want us to be taking good care of our relations. I spoke a little bit about hospice work last week and what an enormous insight it was for me back then to recognize that most people go out of this life the ones that I saw, the people that I saw as they were dying, what they were leaving, either celebrating and harvesting or mourning the lack of how well they took care of their close relations. So our lack of awareness in relation to anger often damages those close and intimate connections in ways that have enormous consequences, especially for the next generation, but for all of us. So I'm just going to stop because I feel like I've been talking for quite a few minutes. And does that make sense?
Oh, yeah. I mean, to me it does. I think I love this idea that anger isn't the first feeling. I think that's such an important thing to be mindful of, because often we might not be able to necessarily connect with someone's anger, but might be able to connect with their fear, because we might have a similar fear. It might just show up in a different way. And it helps us to understand other people, and when we understand other people and their perspectives and where they're coming from, it puts us on a much stronger path to being able to move forward together and, come to some sort of understanding to resolve any difficulty or any issues that come from this anger. And of course to understand ourselves. So we might not understand why we're angry or why our partner's angry, and understanding that it's not the first feeling and to dive a bit deeper will help us to connect better, not only with ourselves but with those around us who are, at that time feeling angry.
Yeah, and it's not a problem if you don't have that consciousness or awareness at the moment that you're angry or at a moment that someone else is angry. You can go back and still learn from it. And you can still go back and, and look and try to understand it. It doesn't require, some Buddha-like, ability to be present. But the thing is to use your life material for this kind of learning is, I think, really, really important. I think also I want to name that a lot of that kind of anger that we might personalize towards individuals is actually sometimes anger in relation to systemic ills and issues. When I'm truly angry with another person, it makes sense to me to translate it internally, and as I said, and to understand and address the root cause of the issue. And, certainly, making use of the list of needs derived from the nonviolent communication work to identify what I wanted and didn't get, like respect or support or mutuality. That's super useful for that awareness. And then when I'm in relation to another person, what I think of as the social change move is, instead of blaming or dismissing or judging that other person for not showing up the way I wanted, I'm going to try to connect and understand what motivated them to do as they did. And this is a social change effort because culturally, and by our current justice system, our retributive justice system, we've been trained to judge and blame and dismiss. This is one of the most powerful ways that the external systems in the world become internalized in us. How we relate to people who are doing things that we don't like is critical for us to, extricate that retributive justice system that lives inside of us. And how we relate to anger is one of the important elements of that. If I'm not yet able to be curious about that other person, it's not a problem. I just need to, apply more understanding or more external support until my ability to get curious and wonder again what was leading them to do what they did has a chance to show up. So I don't want to force myself to make that move. I just want to wait and keep getting the support I need to be able to make that move, because it's critical. When anger belongs to systemic issues or systemic oppression, then I want to avoid the enormous temptation to assign blame to an individual. It's very difficult to be angry at a system and not also become depressed, overwhelmed, or numb. Very difficult, very difficult. But despite that challenge, we need to remember one of the most timeless pieces of wisdom that Dr. King offered, which is that we can't become well-adjusted to a maladjusted society. So even when our outrage or our anger relates to a systemic ill or systemic issue, we need to keep it related to the issue and avoid the temptation to individualize it, to say if this person wasn't in power, that person wasn't in office, if this person, that's a way to keep the status quo going, is to personalize it. We need to become good systems thinkers. one of the things that King said also is he said, our human tendency is to put 90% of our attention on individuals and 10% on the issue. For us to become really good social change systemic thinkers, we need to flop that percentage. 90% on the issue. 90% on the issue. What's the underlying issue related going on here? 10% on the he said, she said stuff. Because the he's and the she's come and go, but the systems of oppression are underlying. They still stay there. We have to keep our eye on the issues. So again, I'm going to stop and hear any thoughts or if that wasn't clear.
Yeah, and I've got a couple of things to say on that actually, Kit. But I just want to mention quickly to everyone listening that you can, of course, type in your questions for Kit on the website, on the webinar software. So please do start firing out any questions that you have. I think the point you just made, Kit, about personalizing these systemic issues is very well timed globally. I think, just looking in the US alone, the way that Donald Trump has been focused on when, we heard the other week in DC that he's in some regard a cultural hero for a culture of capitalism, for a culture of, individualism, of violence, that he's a reflection of so many of the issues that we have in the world and in the US today. And to focus on Donald Trump as the individual as opposed to his reflection of society is somewhat a misguided use of energy, and we should be focusing on the system as a whole, not just on what the latest tweet of one individual has been recently. Because if we focus on the system, we focus on the culture that elected someone like Donald Trump, then we'll actually be able to, look to have other people in power in future.
Yep. And again, that's just it's very interesting that our especially the media keeps putting our nose to the sense of outrage or upset about the individual actors, and I feel really skeptical about that. I want to look for the deeper systemic issues and thinking in order to be the best ancestor that I can be.
We have a question here which asks, can you give us your insight on what it means to turn towards pain? I spoke about this like a little bit. I think for me it means to not run from the emotional aspects of it, to be willing to just sit and howl sometimes, and as often as you can, around how different things are than you want them to be. This is a heartbreaking time to be alive. I remember the day after the election 2 weeks ago, I just had this young woman come to who's involved with the Gandhi Institute, and she's an activist in the community, a young woman of color, and she just walked up to me and just collapsed in my arms. She was just sobbing. She was so sad and scared. And, I just held her. And, and I said to her, I just wish the world was so different. I want it to be so different for you. So for me, one way in which I turn to face pain is just acknowledge how much I want that's not what I'm getting. I don't want to minimize that or tell myself, oh, don't even think about that. That's not possible. I don't want to scold myself or be harsh to myself. I want to acknowledge like the fullness of how different the delta between what is and what could be, what is now and what is not yet. And just to make space for that. And if I'm getting numbed out and I don't have the space for that, I take it seriously. Because as I said last week, we can't become selectively numb. And if we're numb, our ability to be creative, to make use of the opportunities that come our way are diminished. So it's
I think it's critical for us to take care of ourselves. And yesterday I was having coffee with a good friend of mine, and he's got the double whammy going right now of being a man of color who is also Muslim. And and he said, Kit, I'm thinking about what you said about media consumption, because he's like a media, he's constantly on his phone looking at media and all the time, and he just said it's not giving me any peace of mind. I have no chance to recover from one story to another story, and I just am staying so overwhelmed and numb, and it's like I'm losing my life. So we were talking about how critical it is to protect, to create the spaces for yourself to feel pain, which also will then allow you to feel other things like joy or gratitude, even when things are so different than you would want them to be.
Great, thank you. We have a question here which says, how do you shift from focusing on the individual when the individual's actions reflect their ignorance on how oppressive systems function and manifest in the actions of other individuals?
So how do I shift my attention from the individual to whatever it is that they're representing?
Yeah, I think that would be a great place to start. Yeah, and also given that those individuals' actions are the reflection of these oppressive systems, so you might want to focus on the reflection because it points out the system to a point.
Yeah. I mean, I think, it points a little bit towards if any one person, and I think for many people right now, a person that certainly represents that is Donald Trump. If they are his kind of crest, if you will, right now is related to and an outgrowth of culture that you just named, Thomas. Our culture, which above all values individualism, that above all values conspicuous consumption, and that above all relishes violence as a way to get things done. I mean, we have been educated to believe in those things. Those are our national narratives, and so what I want to do is back away from making this person responsible for that. And because for me, holding bitterness towards any other human being doesn't support me. So I'm selfish. I just want to do stuff that makes my life better, because when my life is better, then I'm way more able to help other people around me. So selfishly, I don't want to become lost in bitterness towards someone like a Donald Trump. What's that line from Nelson Mandela? He said, be having bitterness or resentment in you is like drinking poison and thinking you're going to harm the other person, but you're the one who's drinking the poison. I mean, it doesn't help. And in my family background, because I have a lot of alcoholism and other kinds of addiction running way back, both sides, I know that for me, bitterness and resentment are like really bad medicine in my system. So I'm very vigilant. So I'm not willing to hold an enemy image, and I restrict my media consumption. So I'm not continually taking in the last outrageous thing that somebody said. It doesn't help me. It doesn't keep my eye on the ball, which is what am I going to do in my own neighborhood, in my own field of influence. It doesn't help me, and I don't want to do things that aren't helpful to me. And I want to really own that, of course, this is what works for me, and I don't want to take away that other people have other ways of doing things, so I can only say what works for me.
Mm-hmm. Cool. We have a question here about how can we focus on the system without feeling overwhelmed and helpless as an individual or even as a group?
Well, first we need to feel hopeless and overwhelmed. And I would really highly recommend that a sense of that in experience inside of community is a more powerful container than one when you're by yourself. And although sometimes many of us can really experience community that's virtual, especially via social media, there's something about being, for me, being in circle with other human beings when we're together looking at challenging things can be very, very powerful. I've been doing a series of workshops here called Let's Talk About Hate, and I highly recommend you getting people together right now to talk about difficult topics and see what comes out of it. I can tell you the way that we do it in case you want to, use a similar approach. Would be we get people together. We talk about how the issue, how might understanding and feeling more empowered about hate as a force in the world support people's purpose in life. Then we spend some time in small groups and then all together, sort of writing a Wikipedia article. What is hate? What is hate? There's not a shared definition of many powerful forces and issues. So let's first take the time to build a shared definition, or at least articulate how differently we see it. There's never, there's very rarely in any room so far people that I've spent talking about hate there's a shared definition of even that is an issue. So it's a very useful thing to go through. So what is oppression? What are some of the systemic ills that, we can spend time looking. And in the last part of our time together, we spend getting very specific, what's medicine for hate? And I even ask people to think about it, if someone, said, hey, you've just won a grant for $5,000 or for $1,000 or whatever in your community to do something about hate, what's your grant proposal? What would it look like? Be specific. So we spent some time doing that, and it's very interesting, some of the things that, people have come up with as far as medicine. So so that's something that I'm doing right now, is I'm just getting these different groups of people together on that. And actually, we're going to do another one here in a couple weeks, and we're going to film it and make a quick little film about it to help people maybe think about, doing something similar where they are, since many people aren't near us up here in the Rochester, New York area.
That's great, Kit. I look forward to seeing that. I'm actually going to do that myself. I love the idea of, doing the Wikipedia definition, and I like the idea of coming up with, what is medicine for hate. And as you were talking about that, I felt very grateful for my father, who, whenever as a child I would say, I hate something, he would say, don't say hate. Hate's a very strong word. So I was conditioned to try and avoid hate as an emotion, and as even a word that would be used. We have, by the way, please do keep sending your questions through. I have another one here which asks, I wonder if you use Marshall Rosenberg's idea of thinking about the other person's needs and values when you try to separate the person from the issue.
Sure. I mean, the work from Marshall is really pretty integrated now. So definitely, when I'm looking at other people, wondering what values animate them or what needs animate them is pretty core operating part of my operating system. Yep, definitely. And then the whole issue of curiosity, and using my moral imagination to wonder, what might have led them to this perspective, to this attitude, to this position. And it's not really important that I know, but it's my perspective and my wondering that's going to lead to the kind of creativity that nonviolence asks of you. If I'm just in these fixed, static ideas about what another person is, it doesn't leave room for the potential for change, which we've seen, and so many times when something suddenly happens and all of a sudden there's a potential there that didn't exist before. Again, I'd love for you to, for people to read Gandhi's life, especially, just in some of his interactions with some of his opponents, like Jan Smuts in South Africa, in particular, it's very hard. It's much harder to oppose someone who looks at you and loves you in your humanity, even when you're being oppressive. It's so this is part of like what we can, if we can figure out how to do this, I think it will be very good medicine for the world. We need to learn how to do this together, and we've got lots of good examples and resources to learn it.
Absolutely. I have a comment here you might want to, from someone who might want to comment on, Kit. It says, when I find myself sitting in judgment, I find it helpful to remember what isn't a part of us and doesn't bother us. My discomfort is trying to reveal something to me about myself.
Completely. Yep.
That's nice. Yeah, what isn't a part of us doesn't bother us.
Yeah. A lot. I want to just quickly. It's really interesting, and it's been a big part of my journey in terms of, as a white person, understanding, trying to get to shrink my blind spots in relation to race, the issues of racism, and to shrink my blind spots in terms of my own inability to recognize where privilege that I've inherited, how it affects my life and how it affects my family's life. And one of the things that I find this really so tragic, and I really want to change it, is I notice sometimes how hard white people can be on other white people who are not in the same space yet as they are about their understanding of racism. And I think that it's just because the people that have not yet thought about it are just such a painful mirror. So we're going to have to, like, for me, I want to move, and work from love as much as possible. And I think it's critical that we can't lead if we don't love, and the people that we need to learn to love are ourselves, because or else the reflections that other people are going to bring to us of our own unexamined parts, of our blind spots that we all have, no question about whether we have them or not. It's just a question of, do you have even a clue of the map of your own blind spots, and how assiduously are you working on shrinking them?
I think that's a really important point about loving ourselves. And if we want to change the world, start with ourselves, of course.
Well, it's a simultaneous thing. We have to, it's that build the boat and sail at the same time. That's just what you have to do. It's not, there's some sequentialness, I think, but I think, we kind of are asked to do both. But in our day, we don't have to. We can set little times aside in our day to just be building the boat, and then the rest of the day can be sailing it. Mm-hmm. That's okay.
We have another one here. I get angry and heartbroken when a poor person who has less opportunities in life is able to empathize with a white rich person, and the other way around seems to be so distant of happening. I want to share it to know if anyone else feels the same.
Of course. I think I might have mentioned a little bit last week, but I really want to continue to point people towards work that, for me, has been very foundational, the work of Amy and Arnold Mindell, and especially their book, Sitting in the Fire. It's been like one of my Bibles for years, or one of my primers for years. And they speak about how having privilege essentially makes you psychologically weak, less able to value other people, because your own privilege and rank blinds you to the value of others. And Dr. Joy DeGruy speaks about this, that there's actually like a cognitive dissonance that's required when you are someone who has more than others, but you still need to feel good about yourself as a human being. So there's like this sort of cognitive disconnect. She points to it a lot, especially in her book, Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome, when she speaks about the fact that there were people who owned slaves. There were thousands of people during the times when slavery was out that owned slaves, and they literally thought of themselves as good people and good Christians, and they owned other human beings and oppressed them by the fact of the ownership as well as other kinds of abuse. And so there's like a cognitive dissonance that I think when you have privilege that it's almost like a protective barrier. I feel tender saying this. I don't, because I'm sure I have it too, and I'm working on dismantling my own blind spots so that my cognitive dissonance is less required. But I think it's just important for us to recognize that wherever we have rank and wherever we're likely to be blinded to other people. Now, even in our own families, often the older children or the eldest children from any background, tends to have more rank than the younger. How aware are you of that in your own family? Parents, they tend to sometimes be oblivious to the effect of their rank on their children. Middle-aged people tend to be relatively oblivious to the effects of their rank towards younger people. So it's just this great work that all of us can do to work with our identity. And I definitely want to spend more time on that over the course of these next weeks, because it's critical, great work for making the best use you can of who you are, working your identity really consciously to be good medicine.
Yeah, and from a behavior change perspective, the power of how you identify yourself and that whole identity piece is incredibly powerful when it comes to your behavior and your perceptions on the world. So any way that we can identify and help people to shape an identity for themselves that's constructive and will help them be the kind of person they want to be in the world, that's a very, very powerful place to come from. Can you just name that book title? Is it Sitting in the Fire? And who is the author again?
The last name are the Mindells, Mindell. Are Amy and Arnold Mindell. And I'm sure they've written other things too. I just was so taken with this one book that I've never gotten much beyond it, because I'm such a, I don't know, I always have 6 books going at once.
Mainly because you like the smell though, right?
Exactly.
Yes, a buffet of smelly, nice, delicious books.
Best smellers.
I read books electronically, but can't do that because she likes to smell too much of the books, and I totally appreciate that.
I know. You just don't get the it's a physical thing, reading a book too. It's just not just words on the screen. Yeah.
Very cool. I would like to come back around to talking about anger and transforming anger, and you mentioned before about when we're looking at identifying the first feeling and not having to do that in the moment like a Buddha, but thinking back at a time where someone has been angry or we've been angry, and I'm going to take that to myself as some homework to go back, and I like to sort of what I might call sort of cleaning up the past.
Yep.
And going back and you mentioned being curious about it before, so I could be curious with someone who I've been angry with, or vice versa, or at the same time, and taking the time to examine that with them, because I think that would help us to not only clean up what we were angry about, but also to connect really on that first feeling, because I'm sure we can appreciate that first feeling. I mean, is that something that you've done before, Kit, is go back look at a time when you've been angry and as an exercise with somebody else?
Oh, yeah. Actually, a lot of times when I've spoken about this as the broom and dustpan approach to nonviolent communication, when, and then the very, very many years that I've taken to really integrate these ideas into my life, almost all of it was done as a post-rehearsal, because I just was so slow, and because I had this brain or my mouth is often a couple minutes ahead of my brain or my values. So it was a long road for me, and so the way that I managed to get through it with some integrity was to just go back and mourn my limitations, go back and express my regret for, having said something, go back and, said, I wish there was a way, I want to just acknowledge, I wish there was a way to do over, the exchange that we had. And now I'm wondering, when you're ready, could we sit again and look at it? Because I really, really do want to understand your perspective. We can go back and do all those things. Unless someone's dead, we can go back.
Mm-hmm.
And I think actually, even if someone was dead, you could still go back and even in the frame of a role play or journaling or something, so you get the learning for yourself as a way to honor the other person.
Mm-hmm. And I'm sure find peace in that as well. I think little things that happen in our past that we don't clean up sometimes can be, small or big weights on our minds or our hearts.
Yep. Gandhi spoke to, in his little book, the little book that Arun Gandhi wrote called Legacy of Love. He talks about his grandfather's teaching that he offered him around anger, and Gandhi compared anger to electricity. Powerful form of energy, anger. Super powerful, can be harnessed to, light up a town at night, and it can also be something that can just destroy. So how do we harness the energy and the understanding behind, because for me, like when I've hit that intersection of helplessness and caring, it's a tremendously energetic space. So what am I going to do with it is a question. But mostly what I've loved now is a real willingness that I have. And it's been really helpful for me, especially when I'm out and about in the community where I live, to see someone who's really upset and be willing to just approach them and offer support. There's been a couple times, especially with Black youth in the community, where I've been able to do that, use my identity, and to support them and sort of shield them, even, if you will, sometimes from while they have a chance to calm down, and because their anger is much more dangerous for them than my anger is for me. So, I want to think about, I read a book, a Rivera Sun book a while ago called Billionaire Buddha, and I love the main character in that book talked about anger as similar to fossil fuel, dirty and increasingly obsolete. And he said whatever we can do to transform anger into like purer forms of energy would serve us. And finding out what love animates our anger. So he says if we could find ways to love more, we could just keep. It would be like installing solar panels in a cloudy place like Seattle. We'll just keep putting up as many as we need to get the job done. I love that.
I love that so much. Did you say that was called a book called Billionaire Buddha?
Yeah.
Great.
Yeah, Rivera Sun. She's wonderful. Read all of her books, by the way. All of you, read all of Rivera Sun's books.
Rivera Sun's books. I'll got that down. Thank you.
You can see I'm a bookophile. I'm just going to keep showing book titles around.
Good. Only the best-smelling books are recommended by Kit Miller.
Right.
Kit, we've got a few minutes left, so perhaps we could end with a bit of gratitude, and if you can think of anything this week, but I always like to hear what's happening at the Gandhi Institute for Nonviolence. So if you can think of something that happened recently there, or anything else that you'd like to share that you're grateful for, and of course, people listening can jump in and share anything that they're grateful for as well.
Yeah. Well, I really want to put a word out to all of you listening to go, take a look at our website, gandhiinstitute.org. It's a beautiful website. Take a look at the page with our team on it, because I've just worked with some marvelous, extraordinary people, many of them sort of decades my junior, who are just doing such good work and inspire me every day here. One of my young colleagues by the name of Hootie Miller just was highlighted as part of local TV station's Extraordinary People series. And so that'll be up on our website and Facebook in a day or two. So I'm just always grateful every day for the people that I work with, and the work that we do and the feedback that we get.
Yeah, no, me too. And of course, if you wish to support Kit and her work and her team's work, then you can make a donation on the website as well. We had a question come through about the recording of these sessions, and yes, they are being recorded, and we will put them up on the Gandhi Institute website as well. And in probably an email next week to everybody, we'll share a link to find those. Or you could find the recordings and hunt around the website sometime next week to see if you can find them, but we will send a link out to them. I'm also hoping to edit some shorter clips on the things that Kit shared with us so that we can share them with our family and friends in our network. Please do encourage anyone who you think will be interested in coming along for these conversations to come along and sign up online. It's of course open to everyone anywhere. So yeah, if there's anything else from you, Kit? I'm conscious that it's now the hour of 2 p.m. Eastern Time.
Yep. I'm on my way to an event at the Seneca Nation, so I'm looking forward to transitioning out and going to that. I want to just say I'd love feedback from people. As I said last week, this actually isn't my usual modus operandi of how I work. Mostly I work face-to-face and sitting with people, working on projects, not sort of solo teaching in the way I'm sitting here right now in this quiet room. So feedback would be rich for me to receive. I'd be grateful, as well as what else you want to know. I'm super motivated by people's requests. I'd like to speak next week about support and about a lived practice of nonviolence, and just keep exchanging ideas and thoughts with all of you. And I'm just really grateful to everybody for the interest in taking the time, and also grateful for all the things that you're doing in your life. Gandhi said, whatever you may be doing may be insignificant, but it's important that you do it anyway. So 140 people on this call, every one of us doing our small part is not insignificant. So thank you.
Well, on that note, Kit, thank you for your time today, and thanks again to everyone for listening in and for spreading the word. And we look forward to talking with you again next week. So enjoy the rest of your weekends.
Thanks, Al.
Thank you.